Hi everyone, today's video is going to be a hands-on tutorial that covers how to create lightning flows within Salesforce. To get the most out of this video, I highly recommend following along in your own Salesforce environment. This topic is quite advanced, so if you're unfamiliar with some of the more basic configuration tools within Salesforce, such as workflow rules or lightning processes, I'd recommend pausing the video and brushing up on that knowledge before continuing on. This tutorial covers how to create lightning flows, but if you want to learn more about when it's appropriate to use flows versus processes or workflow rules, I have another video on my Ship to Force YouTube channel which does a comparison of each tool at your disposal. Without further ado, thanks for joining us. This is Ship to Force. So real quick, let's go over what Lightning Flow actually is. Lightning Flow is a tool that Salesforce provides which allows you to automate business processes by building applications known as flows. Flows can be used to collect, create, update, and delete information within Salesforce, and also execute logic like decisions and loops, interact with the Salesforce database directly, call Apex classes, and guide users through screens for collecting and updating data. In this video, we're going to solve for a user story in order to show how lightning flows are put together and how they work. So our user story today is, as an opportunity owner, I need the ability to create a project from an opportunity so that I can onboard and track project resources when an opportunity is won. Right off the bat, I can tell that the running user is going to be the opportunity owner. And also we're going to be creating a record within Salesforce, a project record, which is a custom object that we've created within this org from the opportunity page layout. And then we're also going to be doing something with the project resources of that opportunity. The acceptance criteria today is, one, we must be able to automatically create projects from the opportunity page. And then with a subnote here of project resources should be pulled directly from the opportunity. So that's telling me that project resources is a child object to the opportunity object. Second thing here is that there is required information from the user, which is the expected length in months of the project, the start date, and the option to automatically create tasks for the new project resources. This is telling me that we're going to have some way to get information from the running user on the opportunity page layout. Third thing here is that project resources should receive an email notification upon project creation. Just like project resources is a custom object in our org as well. This is going to be a junction object between opportunity, user, and the project object. I'll include the details of these objects and the fields included on each so that you can create these in your org and follow along. All right, one last thing before we get started, let's go over some of our Lightning Flow best practices that we're going to be following as we build out our flow. These best practices are provided by Salesforce themselves, so if you want to learn more, then definitely check out their documentation, and I'll also provide a link to that in the description. The first best practice here is to plan out your flow before you start building. Although time-consuming, unpacking the steps of the flow will give you a blueprint to follow while you're building it out in your environment. I'm somewhat old school and like to use pencil and paper to draft these flows out, but regardless of what tool you use, it's highly recommended to list out the steps and the element types you'll be using within the flows to solve for each of those steps in your flow. 2, build your flows in a test environment. We're going to be using a Trailhead org today to build out our flows. If you don't have a test environment to work in, go ahead and sign up for a Trailhead account. They'll actually give you an org for free. Next, never hard code Salesforce IDs. Salesforce IDs change depending on what environment you're in. So if you hard code an ID in one environment, let's say your test environment, and then you push that flow to the production environment, that ID is going to change. So we're going to have to dynamically reference our IDs within our flow. 4, wait until the end of the flow to make changes to the database. This is actually a best practice we're going to break, but very intentionally, and we'll go over why. For the most part, though, you want to wait to touch the database to make any updates or creating records or deleting any records to your database until the flows actually come to completion. 5, control when running users can navigate backwards. The reason why we want to do this is because if we allow our users to go backwards within a flow, On a step, let's say, where we're creating a record in our database, there is the possibility that the user could potentially create a duplicate record if they advance forward on that same step. So make sure you pay a lot of attention on when a user can navigate backwards and make sure that it's intentional. 6, provide an error handler. So errors happen within flows. It's quite common. Just make sure that you're providing a way for your admin to know when an error happens whenever a user is running that flow. 7, save early and often. Just like with any other cloud application or cloud tool that you've used in the past, you're going to want to save as much as possible. Stuff happens, make sure that it's saved. 8, test as many permutations of the flow as possible. Our flow is kind of straightforward today in that we have one decision that we're using in the flow. And essentially a decision is logic that breaks the flow into multiple paths based on the outcome. I've seen flows with over 10 decisions. So you can imagine the complexity once you have multiple decisions and multiple paths within the flow that a user could potentially go down. So you're going to have to write out detailed test scripts so you can make sure that you test out each path along the flow. Last one here, avoid accessing external objects after DML operations within your flow. So this is what the end result will look like once we're finished constructing the Lightning flow. I have included most of the element types in our flow toolbox to make this example as comprehensive as possible. Before we get started, I want to show you what this is going to look like from a user standpoint once we're finished building out the flow. So I'm on an opportunity. If I scroll down, we can see in my related list that I do have a project resource. That's going to be me. If I click into this really quickly, I can show you that the project field is blank right now. So there is no project created for this project resource. That's one thing that we're going to be doing in this flow. If I go back to my opportunity, I can see that I have my flow component added to the page layout. I'm going to simply type in the expected length, the start date. I'm going to leave create task for project resources set to true, and I'm going to click on next. Now, what this flow did in the back end was it did a couple of things. One is that it created a project, which we'll look at here in a second. Second thing here is it related our project resources to that project. So if I click into my project resource, we can see that it was automatically tied to the project that was just created. And if we click into this project, we can see that the information that I entered into the flow component was defaulted on this project record. Not only that, but there was also a task created for that project resource to review this new project that was created. Now that we know what the flow is going to do whenever we're finished creating it, let's go ahead and build it out in Salesforce. When you're ready to create your flow, go ahead and click on New Flow. And then right off the bat, we're presented with our flow types. Out of the box with Salesforce, we have two different types of flows that we can use. One is the screen flow and the other is the auto-launched flow. A screen flow is going to be used anytime you need to collect information from your user that's running this flow. So for example, in our case, we need to collect information such as the length of the project, the start date, and then whether or not they want to automatically create tasks for the project resources. So we're going to choose a screen flow. If you wanted to create repetitive tasks, sort of background tasks that are going to run automatically, we would choose the auto-launched flow. This would be applicable for scenarios where we want to automatically create tasks, automatically create specific records, or update specific records within Salesforce without any user input. So I'm going to go ahead and select the screen flow and click on create. Right off the bat, we can see we have two areas in our flow builder. On the left-hand side here, we have our toolbox panel. These are going to be all of the elements that we can use within our flow. On the right-hand side, this bigger area, this bigger blank area is our canvas. So we can see right off the bat that whenever we create this flow, we're starting with a blank slate. Let's go ahead and add our first element to our flow, which is going to be the get records element. If you remember back to the steps in our game plan that we laid out, the very first thing that we need to do is get the current opportunity that the user is going to be on whenever he kicks off this flow. We need to explicitly tell the flow what record and what object that we're working with, because flows are agnostic to object. Flows can work with a single object through the entirety of the process, or they can work with many different objects. So we have to tell it what we're going to work with. In this case, we're just going to get the current opportunity record. We're going to tell it that it is the opportunity record that we're going to be querying. And then we have the choice here to filter our opportunity records that we want to get into, that we want to bring into our flow. So if we wanted to get all of the opportunity records from our database, we would simply select here for our condition requirements, get all opportunity records, which adds no conditions to our criteria. It's no filtering, right? In our case, we want to only work with a single opportunity record, and that's going to be the current opportunity record. So we're going to filter by the opportunity ID. So if I type in here ID, we can see here the opportunity ID. That's the field we're going to use in this to compare to the current opportunities record ID. So in value, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new resource. And one common thread throughout the entirety of this flow is that we're going to be creating a lot of these resources. These resources are what's going to be storing the information, the data in our flow that we're going to be using to do things like create records, get records, run logic like decisions and loops. So these resources are going to be important. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new resource. The resource type is going to be a variable. I'm going to call this record ID. So this is going to be the current record ID of the opportunity that we're on. And I'll show you how we're going to actually get that current record ID here in a second. Data type is going to be a text. We can store the record ID as a string in this variable. We're not going to allow multiple values in this variable, and that's because we're working with a single opportunity record. We don't want any default value, and then we are going to mark this as available for input. The reason that we're marking this as available for input is that if we mark it as available for input, the admin is going to get to choose what is actually passed to this variable on the opportunity page layout. The only other thing that we want to do here is decide what fields we want to store from the opportunity in this variable. This is important. These are going to be the fields that we choose to store so that we can use them later on in the flow. If we don't store specific opportunity fields here, we won't be able to use those later on in the flow. And if you try to, you're going to run into unhandled errors. It's a very common situation that beginners run into, is that they reference a specific data point on a record that they thought they got previously in the flow, and then they run into an error because they weren't actually storing that field or that data point in the variable itself. So we have to explicitly tell the flow what we want to store in this variable. In our case, we really only need the owner ID from the opportunity. So we're going to store that field. If we needed other things like stage or amount on the opportunity, we'd simply add those here, right? But we don't need those variables for this specific business process. I'm going to click on done. All right, so now we can see that we have this get records element. One thing that I want to quickly show you is how we actually get that or pass that record ID into this variable that we created. It's pretty simple. If I go to one of my opportunities, we can take a look at this. What I'm going to do is go to the page layout, so edit page. And then in the upper right-hand corner here, we have a flow component. It's our example flow. And on this right-hand side panel, we can see for this flow, there's this checkbox that Salesforce provides out of the box that says pass record ID into this variable. Because we marked the variable as available for input, the admin that's setting up this page in the flow is going to be able to determine what's actually passed into this variable. Salesforce knows that most of the time it's going to be the current records ID that we're going to want to pass into this variable. So they give us this option, this Boolean, to be able to check. And so this is going to be passing in the current opportunities ID. So in this case, this current opportunity Q4, its system ID into that variable for us to be able to use in the flow. So let's hop back to our flow builder. We're going to simply define the path here. So right off the bat, we're getting that current record ID. Once we do that, we're going to want to add a screen to our flow. This screen is going to be collecting information from the user. Remember, we need to collect those 3 data points, one being the expected length in months of the project, the second thing being the start date of the project, and the third thing being whether or not we want to automatically create tasks for those project resources. So here, once we click and drag that, once we add that screen to our canvas, it's going to ask us to define what that screen actually looks like. So I'm going to name this screen create project. You can name it whatever you like. I want to keep the header. So the header is going to be this label. So it's going to tell the user what they're actually doing. The footer is going to be these options right here. So pause, previous, finish. I want to keep that because I want them to be able to click on next, right? To proceed to the next step. But I want to control the navigation for the user. I don't want them to be able to pause this, and I don't want them to go to a previous step. There is no previous screen here, so this really wouldn't be applicable anyways, so I'm going to take that away. The 3 fields that I want to add here is, one, I want them to define the number of months that this project is expected to last. So I'm going to add a number field here. So expected length, months. I'm also going to add a date field for the start date of the project. And then I'm also going to add a third field here for the determination on whether or not we want to automatically create tasks for these project resources. So create tasks for project resources. In this case, we know that most of the time we're going to want to create tasks for project resources. So for this default value, I'm going to add the default value of true for this Boolean. Salesforce provides these global constants here. So in this default value, if I just click here, I can select the global constant of global constants.true. So that's going to default this checkbox as checked. I'm going to go ahead and click on done. Let's add a path from our get records to our screen, and then go ahead and save this flow. Click on save. All right, saving early and often. So now we have gotten the current opportunities record, and then also we've created the screen that the user is going to see on the opportunity page layout for them to be able to input information into. The next step that we defined in our game plan was to create the project record. So once we have input from the user on our screen component, there's 3 data points, we can actually go and create the project record in the backend once they click on next. So I'm going to click and drag this create records data element into our canvas. I'm going to name the step, create project record. How many records are we creating? Well, we're creating one. We're not creating multiple projects for this opportunity. We're just creating one. Next thing we're going to select here is how to set the record fields. So in this instance, we're going to not have a record variable to use here. We're actually going to be using separate variables, resources, and literal values. The reason we want to use separate variables, resources, and literal values is because we're collecting data and using that information on our project record from many different variables. So in our instance, we're going to be using the owner ID from the opportunity record that we got earlier in the flow, but we're also going to be using variables from the screen component that we defined in our last step. So let's use separate variables. And then we're going to define what type of object record we're creating. So in this case, it's going to be a project record. Once we select the project object, we're going to define what fields we actually want to store on this new project record that we're creating. So first off, once I click on field, it's going to show me all of the fields that are available on the project object. So let's start off with expected duration in months. Once I select the field, on my right-hand side, we can see that value becomes available. If I click there, it's going to show me all of my available resources that I can populate the expected duration months field on our project record with. So in this case, we're getting this value directly from the screen component, from the user actually inputting the number of months that this project is expected to last. Let's add the start date. Once again, it's going to be the start date that we collected from the user in the screen component. Let's also define the project lead. So the project lead, we said, was going to be the owner ID, was going to be the owner of the opportunity. So in this case, we're going to be using the value that was stored from the opportunity from the get current opportunity record step that we defined earlier in the flow. To really solidify this point, I do want to point out that if I were to select any of these other data points that we didn't store in that get opportunity step here, we would be able to select it here, but once the user actually went to kick off the flow, he'd run into a unhandled error. So we don't want to do that. In this case, we're going to simply be using the owner ID from the opportunity that we did have stored from that step. And those are the three fields we want to define whenever we are creating that new project. Last thing here is that the flow is going to give us a way to automatically store that project ID of the new record that was inserted into our database so that we can use it later on in our flow. So for this, we're going to have to create a new variable to store that project ID in. So I'm going to create new resource. This is going to be the resource type of variable. I'm just going to call it the project ID. The data type is going to be text once again. Remember, we can store our system IDs as a string in a text variable. There's going to be no default value, and we're not going to make it available for input or output. Once again, we are not going to allow multiple values in this variable, and that's because we're creating a single project, not multiple projects. I'm going to click on Done. Once again, click on Done. So now we have this create project record step in our canvas. We need to add it to our flow path. So I can do that by clicking and dragging and creating a path from the screen to this create records step. So now once the user on the opportunity clicks on next, once they input their information into the screen, they click on next, it's going to automatically create this project record in the backend for that user. The steps that we've added so far do not solve for our requirements, but if you were to activate this and look at the opportunity page, it would actually work. It would get the current opportunity record, it would show us that screen component, and it would create a project record. So let's go ahead and pause the build for a moment and take a look at that. First off, I need to activate this flow. It won't be available on our page layout until I click this activate button. And then once I do that, it's going to be now available on our opportunity page layouts. To add this flow to your page layout, simply go to Setup, Object Manager, the specific object you want to add it to, in this case, opportunity, Lightning record pages, the Lightning record page you want to add it to, click on Edit. Once on your Lightning record page, on the left-hand side, we see all of our different components here. One of our components, one of our standard components, is going to be this flow component. So you can click and drag it to wherever on the page layout you want to add it. And then on the right-hand side panel, we're actually going to decide which flow we want to reference in this component on the page layout. So in this case, it's just going to be the create project screen flow that we just activated. And then automatically this is checked, but we would want to pass the current records ID into this record ID variable like we talked about before. I'm going to go ahead and save this page layout. Now, if I go to one of my opportunities, one of my test opportunities, I can see that this flow has been added to the page layout. Now, as a user, I can enter in the number of months that this project is expected to last. So let's just say 12, and it's going to start next week, and that we do want to create tasks for project resources. This checkbox is not going to do anything. We haven't added that step in our flow yet. That will come in a few steps here. But a project record should be created in the backend, and with these data points and values stored on that new project record. If I click next here, once again, all it does is take me back to this screen. And that's because we haven't defined the next step of that flow for that screen component. So we haven't added a confirmation screen component to our flow yet. So it's just going to bring us back to this initial screen. All we want to check to see is that that new project was created. So we can see that this new project was created. It has the start date that we entered in, 1/20/2020. It has the expected duration in months that we entered in as well. And then the project lead is myself because I owned that opportunity. So perfect. Our flow is working up to this point. So let's go ahead and go back to our flow builder. The next few steps in the flow are going to be around getting the project resources from the opportunity and determining whether or not we need to create tasks for those project resources based on the input from the user in this screen component. So first off, just like we had added this get records element to get the current opportunity that we are on, we also need to get the applicable project resources that were related to that opportunity as well. So I'm going to add a get records element. And the records of the object that we're getting are going to be related to the project resource object. The conditions here. So the conditions that we would use to get the related project resources to that opportunity are that we're going to be checking the opportunity ID of the lookup field on those project resource records. So in this case, we're going to be looking at the opportunity. That's what the lookup field is named on the project resource object. And we're going to say that is going to equal the record ID that we already defined previously in our flow. So we can, once defined, we can reuse this record ID as many times as we want because we know it stores the opportunity ID within our flow. Okay, so this will pull in all of those project resources records that have the opportunity lookup field populated with the record ID of the current opportunity that the user is on. Once we define the filter criteria for those project resource records, we're then going to define which fields from those records we want to store in this variable. Remember, these are the fields that we're going to be using later on in the flow. For our scenario, we're going to be storing and using the email of these project resources. So remember, part of our requirements is to email these project resources the fact that this project was created. So we're going to need that. We're also going to need the resource themselves. So the user ID. This resource field on the project resources object is a lookup to the user object within Salesforce. So that's going to be their user system ID. We're going to be using this later on in the flow to assign our tasks whenever we create our task to that user ID. So they're going to be the assigned to users. I believe these are the only two fields we're going to need to store in the variable. So let's go ahead and click on done. Once again, we want to add this to the flow path. So I'm going to click and drag. And now we have this get record step after the create project record step. Once we have those project resource records in our flow to use, we can then loop through those project resource records to do something with them. Anytime you're using multiple records in your flow and you want to do something individually to those records, you're going to have to loop through those. This is very similar to the concept in Apex and Java, where you have a for loop. And in that for loop, you're essentially iterating through the elements within a collection to do something very specific to each one of those elements. So I'm going to click and drag the loop element to our canvas. I'm just going to name this loop through project resource records. We're going to select the collection variable of project resources from our get project resources step that we previously created. We can go from first item to last item, that's fine. So part of this loop step, Salesforce will actually store each of these elements in a loop variable for you to reference later. So what we're going to do is actually create a new resource because we don't have a loop variable already created. I'm going to select the variable resource type, simply call this project resource loop variable. Select the data type of record. So we want to store that entire record, including the additional fields of those records in this variable. We're not going to allow multiple values, and that's because we are looping through these elements in our collection one by one. It's going to be a project resource object type, and we're going to click on done. All right, our loop has been defined. Let's go ahead and click on done, and let's add it to our flow path. All right, once our loop is defined, then we need to tell the flow what we actually want to do with these records whenever we're looping through them one by one. Well, in our case, we want to create a task for these project resources if the component was set to true to automatically create tasks for this project. So we're going to need to do a couple of things. The first thing here is we are going to need to add an assignment element to our canvas. The reason we are adding an assignment step here is because we need to actually explicitly tell the flow about a couple of variables that we're going to need to use later on in the flow. So the first variable that we're going to define here is the project on the project resource records. So one of the things that we wanted to do is actually tie the project resources, the existing project resource records, to the newly created project record in our database. So if I scroll down, I can see that this project field is available, and we are going to assign it the project ID of that newly created project. Remember, we created this variable earlier on in the flow, and we can reuse it because it's storing that ID in this variable. The second thing we're going to do here is that we need to actually collect the emails from each of these records whenever we're looping through them one by one. And that's because we're going to send out an email to all of these records later on in the flow. So we're just going to create that collection now so that we can reuse it later on in the flow. So what I'm going to do, I don't have a collection already defined for email addresses, so I'm going to create a new resource. I'm going to say this is a variable once again. I'm just going to call this email collection and assign the data type of text. And here we are going to allow multiple values because we want to store all of the email addresses in this single collection. So this is simply going to be a list of emails because we're looping through these records one by one, and every time we loop through a record, we're going to add an email address to that collection. Click on Done. For this operator, we do not want to set it as equals. If we set it as equals, every time the loop runs and we loop through a specific record, we're going to overwrite what was in that collection with this new email value of the record that's being looped through. So what we want to do is actually define this operator as add. What that means is that if we have a collection of 5 records that we're looping through, for each one of those records that has an email address, we're going to be adding that to the list within our email collection. We're going to define the value as the email of the loop variable that we are using, and click on Done. Let's connect that assignment to the loop. And this is going to ask us, how do we want to actually run through this loop? And in our case, we're just going to say for each item in the collection and click on Done. So now we have defined our first step in the loop. Up next, we have to define a decision step. So I'm going to click and drag the decision logic element to our canvas. And the reason we're adding a decision step is that we need to determine whether or not we should be creating tasks for these project resources. I'm going to simply name this Create Tasks Decision. And down here, we actually define the outcomes of this decision. So this is going to be pretty straightforward. We're simply going to be checking that checkbox. So let's say this outcome is going to be create tasks. And the conditions that we're going to be adding are to look at that screen component. So in this case, the create task for project resources screen component, and say, all right, we want this to be the outcome when that Boolean is set to true. Our default outcome will be anytime this checkbox is not set to true. There's going to be times where you have more than 2 outcomes for a decision. For our case, we really only have 2 outcomes based on whether or not that checkbox is true or false. I'm going to go ahead and click on Done. And I'm going to tie that decision to that assignment. So after the assignment happens, we are going to run through this decision. If the checkbox is set to false, we want it to go directly back to the loop. So here, if we click and drag the path back to the loop, it's going to ask us which outcome we want to define that as. And that would be the default outcome. So that's when that checkbox is false. Now we need to create the step for whenever the checkbox is true. In that case, we're going to be using an action element. Action items are predefined by Salesforce, and they allow you to do things like send emails, post to Chatter, quickly create accounts, and then also create tasks. So we're going to go ahead and choose task, and then choose new task. And then here's where we actually define the data points or fields for this task. So first off, we're going to go ahead and label our new action. So let's go ahead and call this new tasks. And then the next thing here is that we want to actually set the assigned to record. In this case, we are going to assign this to the project resource from our flow. So if I look at the variable that we're looping through and I choose the resource, which is the user record within our database, I can actually assign this to the project resource themselves. Then we can define other things like subject, for example. Review, new project. And then also, maybe we want to automatically tie these tasks to the project record. So what we can do is turn on this related to ID field and then choose the resource of project ID, which holds our ID of the newly created project in our database. Click on Done, and then set the create tasks outcome from this decision to come to this new tasks action. All right, once we're finished creating this task for the project resource that's running through this loop, we want it to go back to the loop itself so that it can go to the next project resource in our collection. The flow is going to continue to loop through our project resource collection until it's finished processing our last item in the collection. So if you have 5 project resources related to that opportunity, it's going to run through this loop 5 times. Let's review the flow up to this point. First off, we've gotten the applicable records from our database. That's going to be the opportunity record and the project resources records. We have gotten input from the user on the screen component. We've created a project record, and then we've also looped through the project resource records to create these new tasks. The next thing we need to do is actually update the project resource records so that they're related to the project record. Let's go ahead and do that. To do that, I'm going to simply click and drag the update records element onto our canvas. I'm going to label this step update project resource records. So even though we already have a record collection created for our project resource records, I'm going to specify conditions to identify records and set fields individually. The reason I want to do this is I want to update the project field on these project resource records, so I want to specify that field. For object, I'm going to simply choose the object that we're updating, which is project resources. And then for conditions met, I want to only update those project resource records that are related to our current opportunity. So I'm going to specify this to filter by the opportunity lookup field. And then I'm going to say equals our current opportunity record ID, which we created earlier on in the flow. Record ID. And then for set field values for the project resource records, I want to update that project lookup field on our project resource records. So I'm going to choose project here. And the value is going to be set to the variable that we defined earlier on in our flow for the project ID. So this is going to be the newly created project in our database. From there, we can just click on Done. I'm going to connect this to the loop. So after the loop is finished running through all of the items in the collection of project resource records, it's going to proceed to the update records action. Once we're finished updating the project resource records, we still need to email these project resources the fact that the project was created and that they need to review this project. So let's go ahead and add the action of email. I'm going to click on Send Email. Label it Send Email to Resources. Add the body, so you can either enter a static value as the body, or you can create a new resource to hold the body. I'm just going to type in free text. I'm going to add a subject of new project created. And then we are going to be defining the email addresses that receive this email as a part of this flow. Because these email addresses are not going to be the same every time a project is created, it's not going to be static. right? So we actually need to reference a dynamic collection of email addresses. And this is why we made that assignment and made the email collections variable earlier on in the flow. So I'm going to go ahead and reference that email collection. So this collection is going to be a list of all of the emails of the project resources that were in the project resource collection. And I'm going to go ahead and select done. Let's go ahead and tie that action into the flow. So once the update records action is completed, we will proceed to the send email to resources action. Now really the only thing left is to create the confirmation screen component so that once the user clicks on submit or next on the screen, they'll know that these actions were completed successfully. So let's go ahead and add a screen component here. And we're just going to call this confirmation page. And we are going to add some display text here. In this display text, we will reference the project ID that was created. So let's say success project. So if I want to reference a resource or a variable, I can. Let's go ahead and reference that project ID variable. That's going to be the system ID to this new project that was created as part of the flow. And we're going to say project ID was created. And on this page, let's keep the header, but let's get rid of the footer. We don't want them to pause or go back a step. So let's go ahead and uncheck show footer and then click on done. Let's tie that into the flow itself. Let's go ahead and save and activate our flow, then we can test it. To test the flow, I'm going to create a brand new opportunity so that we can work with clean data. I'm going to quickly type in the required fields. Opportunity Q1, enter in a stage, see what else is required here, a close date. And then I'm going to save that. On this opportunity, I do want to add a project resource. Let's just add myself as the project resource. I don't want to tie this project resource to a project because that's what we're going to be creating and then automatically tying to as a part of this flow. The resource will be my user record. And then let's add a role as well. And then the email will be defaulted based on the email on my user record. So let's go ahead and save that. So now that we have a project resource, I can go ahead and test this flow out. So for the expected length, let's go ahead and just enter in 22 months, start date of March 4th, 2020. And then let's say we do want to create tasks for project resources. Let's go ahead and click next. All right, as we can see here, we got a success message. So success project ID was created. So let's go ahead and check that out. Let's first go to the project resource. What we're expecting to see is that this project resource is now tied to the project itself. So we can see that was successful. If I click into this project, we should see the correct expected duration in months. So we see 22 months and then the start date of 3/4/2020 and the project lead of myself, which was the owner ID. Not only that, but we also see that the new task was created. So review new project was created. When we click into the task, we'll see that it's assigned to my user because I'm the project resource it was created for. And then also the subject was set by the flow as well. Also, if I jump to my email, I can see that I did receive an email from Salesforce automatically whenever that project was created. So this flow looks like it's working correctly. Let's go ahead and jump to the flow builder. I want to show one more thing before we sign off. Now that our flow is complete and all of the logic is working correctly, we still want to add error handling steps within the flow itself. For any data-related steps in our flow, we want to have some way to let the admin of our organization know that an error happened when it does. So for that, we're simply going to add an action. For this, we're just going to be creating an email. We're going to send an email. For this example, I'm going to only create one error handler step in our flow, but in the real world, the best practice is to create an error handler step for every step along the way of your flow that touches the database. So anytime you create a record, update a record, get a record, delete a record, you should have an error handler step that follows suit. Name it error handler email. For the body, I'm going to create a new resource here. And the reason that we want to do this is that it's not going to be a static body. For this error handler step, we actually want to reference the variables that we were using in the flow so that the admin can actually see what was being populated when and what the user inputted in their screen components to really dive into the error at hand and debug it. So I'm going to create a formula that essentially references all of the resources that we used within our flow. So once you've added all of your resources to the formula, go ahead and click Done. So now we're referencing this resource in the body, and that resource is made up of all of the other resources that we've used along the flow. For the subject, I'm simply going to say error happened. You can either statically define this like I just did or create another resource. And then I'm going to define the email address and just put in the email address of the admin for this org. Let's go ahead and click Done. Once we've created that error handler step, we can go ahead and tie it to the update records action so that if the update records action fails, it's going to go ahead and send this email to our admin. To quickly recap the flow that we created, we started out by getting the current opportunity record that we were using. Next, we displayed a screen component to our user to get input from them on the project that was going to be created. After we got input from the user, we created the project record in our database and then got the related project resource records to that opportunity. Once we created that collection of the project resource records, we looped through them to not only make the decision on whether or not to create those tasks, but if applicable, we created those tasks in the database. Once the loop was finished, we updated those project resource records and then sent an email to the users associated to those project resources. Once we successfully emailed the resources, we displayed a confirmation page to the running user on the opportunity record. Not only that, but we also created an error handling step just in case one of our data steps failed. I hope you got a lot out of this video. If you have any questions on these steps, please leave a comment or email me at shiptheforce@gmail.com. Thanks, and until next time, this has been Ship the Force.